we want for GenAI Collective to have a seat at the table. So that means convening really leading voices in AI in the DC area, whether it's in the technology and innovation space or whether it's on the Hill. That's another priority for us.
Welcome to DC Decoded, a Gen AI podcast where we break down the impact, the breakthroughs, and the people shaping the future of AI in our nation's capital. I'm your host, Sam Lee, and I'm excited to kick off this first episode with two incredible guests from the DC chapter of the GenAI Collective. I'll be speaking with Catherine McMillan, the executive director of the chapter, and Nate Barola, a founding member of the chapter. We'll dive into what the GenAI Collective is, the role of the DC chapter, and why community-driven AI innovation is so important in the city, now more than ever. One quick note about this episode that will be different for future episodes. My face is not featured because I had the hide self-view function on. This will not happen in future episodes, but I'm going to frame this first episode as is really wanting to highlight our guests. So whether you're a policymaker, a tech professional, an entrepreneur, or just someone interested in the intersection of AI and governance, this episode is for you. Let's get going. Welcome to DC Decoded, where we break down the impact, the breakthroughs, and the people shaping the future of AI in our nation's capital. I'm Sam Lee. I will be your host for this podcast, and this podcast is under the GenAI Collective's DC chapter. Today, we're going to be talking with the executive director and a founding member of the DC chapter. First, we have Catherine McMillan. Catherine is a tech community builder and strategist with a background in consulting, startups, and nonprofit management. She brings expertise in business development, AI governance, and ecosystem building. As the DC chapter lead for the GenAI Collective, she facilitates deep discussions on AI's impact and organizes events that connect founders, technologists, and researchers. She also leads DC Tech Parties, a growing community redefining how professionals in DC network and collaborate. Passionate about the intersection of AI, entrepreneurship, and community-driven innovation, Catherine creates spaces where ideas and relationships thrive. Catherine, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
And we also have Nate Barola. Nate is a researcher and advocate at the intersection of policy, sustainability, and emerging technologies. With a background in environmental science and marine science, Nate brings years of experience spanning policy analysis, AI governance, and creative outreach. As an organizer/policy analyst with the GenAI Collective DC chapter, he assists in community discussions on the societal and environmental impacts of AI while managing the Green Intelligence Resource Hub, an open source database compiling research resources on different AI and environment application uses. Nate's work bridges environmental science and generative AI, fostering innovation and cross-sector collaboration to shape a more sustainable future. Nate, welcome to the podcast as well.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's get into it. Well, first of all, what is the GenAI Collective for people who might not know? And we'll get into the DC chapter specifically, but what is the GenAI Collective? Catherine, we could start with you.
Sure, I can take this one. The GenAI Collective is the country's largest AI community of over 25,000 practitioners. And that's everything from founders to investors to researchers or just enthusiasts. Started out in SF, but they had an ambitious plan to go into every single major city across the country. And now the collective is expanding globally.
Yeah, and specifically with the DC chapter, Nate, maybe you could talk a bit about how long it's been in existence and what it has done so far.
Yeah, so the DC chapter for the GenAI Collective has grown tremendously, like over the past couple of months. I believe I joined the team about a month or two after our founding in DC, I think like back in October or something like that, but it feels like we've been working on this for like years. So the DC chapter has grown to like 13 people, like with our staff and all our volunteers. And again, like at the core of our like messaging and, branding for AI governance and responsible AI, it's all about community. Like at the end of the day, like no matter what type of denomination you are, from AI engineer to policy analyst, as an example.
Right. And Catherine, did you two meet in Gen AI or did you know each other before this?
This is actually
This is a
a
funny story.
funny story. So, as I was getting the chapter ramped up, so we like had a kickoff, I started going to a lot of different events around DC, specifically in the AI space. And I noticed that a lot of these events, I would see a very similar face. And Nate and I had the chance to talk at some of these events, but it was at the Google Public Sector Summit that was like the straw that broke the camel's back. It was at that moment I was like, he's going into all of these rooms, he's hustling, and I want him on my team. I want him to join me in creating a community. And that very day, like I actually pitched him to to join the GenAI Collective core team. I my rationale was like if he is taking the effort to go into all of these spaces and meet a bunch of people, then he's probably one of the most qualified people to bring people together. And so I was very grateful that Nate was receptive and decided to take a leap of faith with me for the GenAI Collective.
Yeah, Nate, does that all check out? Is that all true? Or do you have anything to
That's
add?
all. That's all verified. It's all verified. Yeah, I believe we had seen each other like, my goodness, like four events in a row, just like concurrently, and
Back
then
to
like
back.
back to. It was crazy. Like so it was like a happy hour. It was the Google Public Sector Summit, and I just like I kept on noticing the same person over and over again, and then finally after a while, like we just started talking. And then my own like AI journey had barely, it was very nascent. So like I wanted to get more into the space. And then I think what was really different about Catherine was that instead of being like she told me, I remember this, like we were standing in the middle of the Google Public Sector Summit or just talking, and she told me that like if you want to make a difference in the AI space, you have to be like an active, not like an like a not a passive like listener or whatever, but an active participant, like in like hosting events and bringing people together, being a super connector, quite literally, which is what Catherine is and what the DC chapter for the GenAI Collective is. So yeah, all verified. And then fast forward, it's 2025. We got plans. We're hustling. We're doing our thing
We
here.
have plans.
Yeah.
Yes. Speaking of plans, why don't you let everybody know what those plans are? What are the goals and initiatives for Gen AI DC chapter in 2025?
Yeah, I can hit some of them and then Nate, I think definitely you can talk about the content vertical. So the first phase was really taking it from 0 to 1 and then scaling it so that we actually have the capacity to be ambitious. At our core, we are a community and we convene in person. And the primary bread and butter of GenAI Collective writ large is to have a monthly cadence of meetups. That is our responsibility to uphold that. On top of that, we want for GenAI Collective to have a seat at the table. So that means convening really leading voices in AI in the DC area, whether it's in the technology and innovation space or whether it's on the Hill. That's another priority for us. And then a final one is kind of strategic partnerships and initiatives, collaborating with other organizations and partners in the district, as well as mobilizing the community members themselves through publications, working groups, and things like that. So we're really building an organization from the ground up, and I hope that GenAI Collective becomes a institution in DC.
Yeah. And can you give some examples of meetups that we have had so far and meetups that we want to have this year?
Yeah, so last year we had two meetups. The event type for that was largely kind of like a networking workshop. So we would put people into very small discussion groups and we would rotate them out a couple of times throughout the night around a specific topic. The first one was just sort of like a kickoff for getting to know the DC team and getting to know our values. But the second one, we did a specifically AI policy pop-up. Actually, Nate, you'd be best served to talk about this one.
Well, so AI policy is kind of like the bread and butter, like for a lot of like what we do like here at the GenAI Collective, because obviously you have to be aware of like what's going on in like the political arena, not just like domestically, but also internationally as well. So Catherine and I ended up talking and we ended up realizing that like AI policy was like an untapped kind of gold mine of like discussions that we could have with, it doesn't matter like what type of sector you're from. You could be in health tech, you could be in education, you could work in government, but like AI policy fundamentally impacts like every single sector just because of all the different like aspects of it. So that event in November, correct me if I'm wrong, was like a really cool workshop because we had rotating tables where, so ahead of time I had just written a really quick policy brief. Catherine was instrumental in like reviewing it. And then I'd found this really cool like AI policy tracker that I was like, okay, it literally like shows a map of the world and it shows like what the key defining AI pieces of legislation are from Brazil all the way to the US, even though at the federal level we don't have anything yet, you never know. But at the state level, there's plenty of discussions going on from California all the way to Colorado. So long story short, we just had these like rotating workshops where folks discussed like different types of questions from like a domestic lens, from an international lens, and it was super cool to kind of see the thought process of everybody.
Right. And how have the conversations about AI policy specifically changed since the change in administration? Have either of you noticed any changes yet, or are they still to come?
I think that's a little bit TBD. I mean,
Yeah.
we haven't held an event
That's why we have a
this year
podcast, so
so
we can
far.
talk about those changes.
Okay, yeah, I think there's a strong appetite for innovation right now
Yeah.
and accelerating AI, given the um, the AI arms race
Mhm.
between China and the US. And so I think that is bankrolling a lot of these big players like OpenAI. Also, Anthropic received a lot of funding.
Mhm.
So it's a race. It's a race, and we're gonna feel the impacts of that. Um, I've talked to a couple of people on the Hill, actually in Congress, like, and they're worried. They're really worried about this because there's so much uncertainty, and it's just moving so fast that there's no way to put the correct guardrails around it without inhibiting the right amount of innovation.
Right. Nate, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, first of all, I'll prefix this by saying that this is my personal opinion. This is not representing like anybody just except myself. So I agree with Catherine on like a couple of notes. So I think, so first of all, it's important to realize that the new administration repealed the Biden administration's like executive order, which, you know, it depends on who you talk to. That was kind of playing a little bit defensive with like AI governance and safety, trying to instill a sense of security when it came to these rapidly advancing technologies that will impact the very way that we live and work and breathe. And so now we're entering this era where, like Catherine said, there's this like massive focus on business, there's innovation. The recent Stargate project that just got announced by OpenAI about, I think, a week ago now, maybe two, has like definitely driven the amount of investment with a massive $500 billion in like collateral over, I think, the span of a couple of years of development. So you have all this push for business, you have all this push for innovation, but then you have an amazing thing that just came out called DeepSeek, which worried everybody because DeepSeek was trained on a fraction of the amount that GPT-4 was trained on. And so you have this like new like, you know, tool that just came out of China, which is like our rival, you know, for lack of a better analogy, in this like AI arms race that Catherine just said, and people are scared. My biggest thing is that from a sustainability perspective, I feel like the conversation about AI and sustainability isn't happening a lot in the US. However, it is happening a lot internationally with like the AI Action Summit that's happening in like Paris, France right now. Hugging Face is a great example of a company that's like focusing a lot and like trying to bring a voice to the sustainability side of things. And that's just an observation that I've just noticed here.
Right. So there's clearly like a lot of challenges happening with the AI and specifically AI policy space this year.
Right.
So what does that mean for GenAI DC? Is there any initiative or incentive to like try and address them through what we already do? Any new initiatives? Like what does GenAI do about the AI challenges this year, specifically in the DC chapter?
mean, I can take this, Catherine,
Yeah,
if
you
you
can
want to
go
start
ahead
it.
and start and I can build off of it.
Yeah. So Catherine and I are part of like a policy impact team that connects like the entire kind of GenAI Collective chapter network as a whole. And so it's been very interesting because you have all these challenges that are coming out with like AI policy. And so what can GenAI Collective do as an organization? And the DC chapter specifically is uniquely positioned to, like Catherine said, like earlier, have a seat at the table when it comes to these discussions where the focus appears to be leaning towards business and innovation rather than like a lot of governance and safety, which appears to be being swept under the rug. So the way that I see it is that GenAI Collective is building our momentum with expanding our team. We are hosting all these different events that have different themes that relate to governance, to safety, and other aspects as well. And so by building this momentum, not only are we building kind of the brand name for like the DC chapter, we're also signaling to all these different parties that make up the DMV, like local tech ecosystem, saying like, hey, we stand for community, we stand for responsible AI principles, and we stand for making sure that, no one gets left behind in this AI arms race. Catherine?
Like you said it really perfectly. I think the thing that I really want to prioritize with some of these first events is creating champions of the cause, champions who will invoke the GenAI Collective name in certain environments, will bring us into conversations. And then once we get that group of people who really care about shaping the future of this technology, then I think we can start to spin out really interesting initiatives like working groups or white papers or articles. I'm actually working on the thought leadership arm of GenAI Collective right now and how we're going to build the infrastructure for that. And I think that DC is like the perfect place to start. Another thing that I want to say as well is that when you go to these traditional DC happy hours, and I think we've all been to one, where you go in there, you write your name down, and you're just looking to talk to someone, but it seems like there's this game happening where there's the people that really feel like they have nothing to prove, so they're enjoying themselves, and there's the people that really, are putting on a mask and are trying to present themselves in a certain way to see who you know and to squeeze out the most out of that event, which is valid, right? You want to get a return on your time. But I think what sets GenAI Collective apart is that they care about connection, authentic connection, and transformative conversation. And I remember very vividly the first the kickoff event that we had in October, and we had just had like a really vibrant conversation with the table. You had people you had an executive from KPMG to, someone who works in the AI safety space to, like there was an incredible amount of diversity at the table. And then I posed the question to the group, when's the last time that you had this kind of conversation with a group of strangers? And I was met with silence. For many people, it had been years. Like the last time that they had that conversation was in a seminar in college. And some couldn't even remember the last time that they got that deep and that passionate about these topics, or really any topic. And that's what I want to maintain. So with GenAI Collective, and Sam, you mentioned this before as another question, like what are other kinds of meetups that we want to have? We want to have the panels, we want to have the speakers, but we also want to have really small curated discussions where we are choosing the people that are in the room and building those connections with the hope that that connection will lead to something greater and magnify its impact. So a good example of that is our AI soirée that's coming up. I'm hoping that this will be a reoccurring series. Basically, we're going to put 25 people in a living room and ask them a question around are humans even aligned systems, and how can we even expect to have AI alignment if we ourselves are not aligned in our interests and motivations around this technology. So I'm hoping for really vibrant discussion there, and I'm hoping that it's a tradition that we can maintain and keep on going with the DC chapter.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that AI soirée is Thursday, February 20th at night. This episode is going to
21st.
the 21st. Oh my gosh, I'm
Yes.
sorry. Friday the 21st. I will include the sign up link in the show description. So make sure to sign up if it is not sold out at that point or at capacity. But make sure you guys check it out. And exactly, like I think Gen AI, especially the DC chapter, we're trying to emphasize that connection in addition to all the great things we're doing. One last point about this before we move on is I feel like both of you are getting to this larger theme of sometimes the tensions that rise up between like bureaucracy and policy and innovation. And I would argue that a lot of the newcomers or returners to DC, they're of the mold that basically bureaucracy is like the enemy of innovation. But I am sensing that you two and other people in the Gen AI collective think that there's a different way. So specifically, like with AI, what do you say to people who say that the less policy, the less regulation, the better it will be for AI to innovate? What would you two say to that?
I mean, I can go ahead, give like a preliminary, because that's a complicated question. I mean, that's a good question, and there's no like clear answer, but I can give you like my best guess. I mean, this is again like my own personal opinion when it comes to like what I've learned with all the courses that I've taken and just the people that I've spoken to that are like pro business. And like on the other hand, you have very pro like active policy people that argue that we need as much policy as possible because this technology, I think one of the biggest things that people forget, unless you read the news or unless you're like an AI techie, is that this technology changes like every single day. You have like all these open like models that are like constantly getting updated every single day. A new update just like comes out, changes everything, right? So from a policy perspective, the argument that like, you know, the less policy, the better, the more innovation we can do, that to me, like for my own personal opinion, that to me spells disaster because like that completely disregards like the human in the loop argument where there's a focus on like safety, there's a focus on governance. Like earlier, Catherine described like putting guardrails, whatever that takes the form of. I have no idea on like AI development. And I argue that like we need some degree of element with that. Now, how much? That's a subject of contention. And like obviously that's subject to the political turmoils of like whatever administration is currently in power. And so we're going to see kind of like, you can almost like compare like two different eras, like with the previous administration that like kind of touched AI like a little bit and like put the foundations for this administration to kind of do what they want. It's almost like two different attitudes where the previous administration was focused on, you know, governance and safety to a certain extent, but still wanted to provide innovation for companies in the US to develop like their models. And now you have a complete shift with the pendulum where it's all about business and innovation. There is some necessity for governance, but like way less. So that's, again, my opinion.
Yeah, Catherine, do you want to jump in?
Hey, I just have so many thoughts about this. I think people think it's all or nothing, and that is not right. It's absolutely not. And the answer is unfortunately somewhere in the middle, which no one can agree on.
Yeah.
So, the thing that really bothers me about all of this is, and this is not really directed at anyone in particular, this is very general, but people are very hand wavy about everything. They're hand wavy about the kind of innovations that we're going to have in the groundbreaking technologies and automation and agentic AI.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the hand waviness of all these existential risks and we need to stop everything. We need to have all these guardrails. That's not going to happen. And this is a little bit dangerous. So what I'm trying to do is kind of like what a maestro in an orchestra does, which is orchestrate, like get people on the same page, get people aligned. With these conversations, we have a unique advantage in DC of having our system of governance for the country here that makes all of the major decisions, not only on a national scale but global scale. We have all those key decision makers here. We also have a very robust tech and innovation community, and like we're not too far away from New York, so there's a lot of potential here to actually get people talking. I know Nate and I both have experience with Blue Dot Impact. So, for those who don't know, Blue Dot Impact is a UK-based nonprofit organization working on developing AI safety programs, specifically courses that help to bring folks who are interested in careers in AI safety to have that that knowledge and skill set. There's the alignment track, and this is like basically a free ad for them. There's the alignment track,
Not
and there's the AI
sponsored yet.
governance
Not
track.
sponsored yet.
No, Joshua will be happy about this. I think Nate and I both did the governance track,
Yeah.
and I eventually facilitated the course as well. So I took it 3 times actually. And time again, I really felt, a little bit of frustration that there weren't more negotiations or compromises to find that better middle point, instead of just having people who are like lobbying for tens of billions of dollars to just, bankroll them working on AGI. Why can't we just have these conversations and negotiate and build that future together, co-create it? And that's why I want to bring powerful and passionate visionary people in the same room, because this is not going to happen without organizing people. And so, going back to what I was saying before, the hand waviness, I want us to get concrete and get to brass tacks about what is the type of future we want to build. What does it look like? And be specific.
Can I add something really quick to that? There's actually a really good book that goes into detail about what Catherine is describing with like the hand waviness of like how there's like a proliferation of like a bunch of AI companies that will like attempt to sell you a service, but then like at the end of the day, the service doesn't really do much, or it's just kind of like what they call like a GPT wrapper. So it's called AI snake oil, and it basically like describes like a lot of like what we're seeing right now with like all these like AI companies, with the exception of like a few that can actually do what they're talking about. But a lot of companies just like sell a GPT wrapper in the hopes of like trying to make a quick buck. And so like it's a great book for anyone that's kind of like looking to understand like the current landscape and like how you can recognize like a GPT wrapper from like an actual bona fide AI solution that'll, increase productivity by like 70% or whatever. So
Right. Yes, I will link that in the show description as well. Okay, now let's talk about DC Decoded, this podcast you're listening to. So, Nate, as our project manager for the podcast, can you talk a bit about what exactly DC Decoded is and what listeners can expect?
Yeah, so DC Decoded represents a very unique opportunity to explore like what the DMV tech ecosystem is all about. And so when I was going to like all the events that I've done through the GenAI Collective and also like independently just going to see like what the competition was all about, I was always meeting these fascinating people that had stories behind them. Like we had startup founders all the way to KPMG executives or just people that worked in consulting. And I always often wondered, why can't we just get their like stories in like half an hour, 40 minutes, whatever? And so ergo, DC Decoded was born. And so what you can expect from this amazing podcast is every episode we are going to highlight basically like talent in the DMV to illustrate the various different sectors that make up the entire DMV like tech ecosystem, from founders all the way to people that work in tech to government. Honestly, the sky's the limit.
Yes, and the DMV is DC, Maryland, Virginia. If anybody is not familiar, we are not talking about where you get your license
renewed.
Yes, the license.
Just to clarify that. I did not know that before moving to the area, so just to clarify. But yeah, exactly. And we are going to aim to post episodes every other Wednesday on all the major podcast platforms. And exactly what Nate said, I think we are starting with just these virtual, probably one-on-ones, but eventually we could get to like one-on-twos, one-on-threes, and then also live events. And that is definitely a goal I have for the podcast this year, to do a live event, hopefully like collaboration with other organizations. In terms of who should tune in, pretty much anybody interested in AI or has AI experience in the DMVs, that's policymakers, tech professionals, entrepreneurs, students, friends of all of those, parents of all of those. It's really meant to be a podcast that, yes, is at the intersection of AI and DC, but once you get into that intersection, we are a very welcoming community. So definitely encourage anybody who is even a little bit interested in what is going on AI related in DC to check us out. In terms of upcoming episodes, we are in the middle of scheduling some. Nate has been great about that, and we will announce guests as soon as they're scheduled and get people excited about it. Catherine, as our number one listener and supporter, what are your hopes for the podcast?
Yeah, I mean, number one, I hope to be converted into a podcast person. It's been hard for me for a while to listen to a podcast because I don't drive anymore. When I was driving, it was a lot easier, but on the go, it's just harder for me to focus. So looking to get back into podcasts through this one. Another thing is I want for people to really feel like they're a part of something. So for the guests that join in and for those who are listening in, I want them to know that they have a voice and they have a space in this community. Um, GenAI Collective, in my eyes, is all about uplifting emerging AI and the people behind it. And I don't want this to be any different. So I'm excited to find all of these really cool people, or you guys will find all these really cool people, interview them and share these insights because ultimately I think stories is what makes a difference and is what compels people to act.
Exactly. Any last thoughts about anything we've talked about before we ask slash beg people to subscribe, guys? Any last thoughts?
It's going to be a very cool year, not just like for AI development and not just for the podcast, not just for the DC chapter. We are literally making history with like everything that we're doing. And I think the one thing that I want people to take away from this conversation and just like from the podcast in general is that we are in a very unique position. DC is it's the capital of the US. It's like the political heartbeat, but it's also got, like Catherine pointed out, a very robust tech ecosystem that I feel like I didn't know that before I moved here. I thought DC was all about politics and consulting. That was it. And then here I come like into the DC chapter, and then I discovered that there's a whole tech ecosystem here. So I feel like Catherine said, stories are what make life very interesting. And being able to kind of give people a voice through this podcast series is what I'm like really super excited for. Catherine?
One other thing, it might be a little bit of a tangent, but I promise it relates. So if you didn't know this, actually DC is considered to be the loneliest city in the US for a number of reasons. It's a transitional city. It's not a place where a lot of people put down roots. It's expensive, a lot of things. And and also if we think about AI, right? If we think about AI chatbot friends and people who kind of don't really feel like they have a community or a social network. I mean, this is trying to solve both problems. How will we interact with and engage with AI in healthy ways that support human enablement and thriving, and then also solving the loneliness epidemic problem, which is bringing people together to talk about important things. And I hope that other community leaders rise for other issues like around mental health, education, and do like a similar thing that we're doing here, which is creating space for a lot of different passions and places that need impact and investment. For me personally, that is AI. Um, and for everyone listening, just know that everyone on this team is very approachable and reachable. And so, especially if you reach out to me on LinkedIn, I will be very receptive. And I can speak for Nate on this. He also is very active and responsive on LinkedIn.
Too much so, but it is, no, very much so. Catherine, myself, any of the team members, they're the kindest people you could meet. And they're also the most ambitious too when it comes to what we want to do here. So,
Yes.
And I would be remiss not to make a call to action, which is if you do want to get involved, feel free to reach out. And if you also feel like your company or organization is aligned with our goals, also feel free to reach out. We're actively looking for sponsors and partnerships for
Yes.
this year.
And all the relevant contact information will be in the show description. So feel free to reach out there as well as another avenue. But anything else on either of you guys? Or is that?
no, that's it.
Yeah, I agree I've heard that loneliest city statistic a few times now from different sources, and I am happy that we have something like GenAI and a different initiative that some people I know are starting, but I'm going to stay on message and support the DC chapter of GenAI right now. But yeah, just echoing Catherine and Nate, it's going to be a very exciting year. I think the DC chapter has a lot of momentum, and I don't think me and the others that were recently onboarded would be onboarded if there isn't that momentum. So I will just focus on making this a really good podcast as much as I can. That's a wrap for this episode of DC Decoded. This episode featured Catherine McMillan and Nate Barola, both members of the GenAI Collective's DC chapter. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to subscribe to DC Decoded on your favorite podcast platform, whether that's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or something else. And if you found this discussion valuable, we'd love it if you left a rating or review. It helps others discover the show. For more on the DC chapter of the GenAI Collective, upcoming events, and ways to get involved, check out the links in the show description. And if you're interested in collaborating, sponsoring, or just learning more, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you 2 Wednesdays for the next episode.